Hello everyone, thanks for that introduction, Bill. So I've developed and I'm evaluating an approach to transdisciplinary working based on mapping. The idea is that different researchers get to know each other's contrasting research methods a bit through shared activity around making and using maps. So I'll firstly briefly introduce multi-method mapping and the transdisciplinary project with which I'm evaluating it. And then I'll present some preliminary findings so far. So I'm going to keep the presentation hopefully to about 10 minutes to allow time for comments and questions at the end. And I particularly welcome comments. I'm partway through the analysis of the fieldwork, so this is very much a work in progress. It's not a finished project. So this lovely graphic, I didn't create this graphic. It was partly developed by Molly O'Halloran, who some of you will know through NACIS. So the basis of multi-method mapping is that different practices of mapping can reflect very different research approaches, and therefore contrasting types of researchers, perhaps along with their research participants too, can take part in mapping as a shared activity, but in ways that, in different ways that remain authentic to their own methods. So it's been noted in the transdisciplinarity studies literature that researchers who use different research methods can find it challenging to know where to begin conversations on their different methods. Multi-method mapping is a space in which collaborating researchers on a transdisciplinary project can have exposure to each other's methods and therefore learn a bit more about them. So I conceptualised mapping into 5 different but overlapping types: words-focused, georeferenced, sensory, creative and visceral. Words-focused mapping uses maps to prompt place-based stories or discussion. Georeference mapping is where features and data are located using coordinates. Sensory mapping pays attention to the senses during map making or using maps, including touch and movement. Creative mapping is interested in participants' creative interpretation of place and space. And finally, visceral mapping is about researchers' feelings and emotions as a particular type of apprehension of place during mapping. So, for example, a researcher who's using qualitative interviewing and their GIScientists colleague who's conducting spatial analysis of data might conduct a mapping activity that combines word-focused and georeferenced mapping. Here they might first co-facilitate and co-analyse walk-along interviews using the GIS maps as a prompt. Reciprocally, these researchers might then co-create a GIS map of geolocated, that is, georeferenced words from the walk-along interviews. So the project that I'm trialling multi-method mapping with is exploring the barriers and opportunities to nature recovery in 3 English field sites. The project has researchers from several disciplines using lots of different research methods. I carried out 2 sets of mapping activities, but I'm going to concentrate on just one here today. This was with a qualitative social scientist and 2 ecologists, one of whom is a spatial ecologist using GIS. So I facilitated a talking mapping activity in which we shared maps of both the quantitative ecological analysis, which is shown bottom left, and also the qualitative analysis to the right on a shared online board, Padlet. So this activity reflected georeference mapping and words-focused mapping. I created the map of qualitative data to demonstrate the analytical method that the qualitative research was using. That was thematic analysis, using the shape of the study area as shown here. And I wish I'd had time to create more contrasting and alternative maps, like I had several qualitative maps to share to the Padlet board. So, as you can see, 2 very different types of mapping. And the different knowledges were very deliberately not combined in the same map frame, in the same surface of the map. It is the methodological discussion around the maps that was intended to be the focus of the exercise, what I've called mapping space. the space of reflexive exploration around maps, based loosely on Del Casino and Hannah's map space. The activity reflects the potential for methodological discussion around maps that are explored by Brown and Knopp and Cope and Elwood, for example. So just to very quickly show you something from the other mapping activity, which I called the corporeal mapping activity. So multi-method mapping is not just concerned with verbal discussion around maps as a means of methodological exploration, but also sensory experience during mapping. This slide is what one of the researchers said about an ethnographic sketch mapping activity that we did together. The activity was sensory not just in terms of physically experiencing the field site that we visited, but was also designed to utilise the value of the movement of the pencil across paper as you're sketch mapping and the connection to thought processes as you're doing that. So multi-method mapping did show some potential in getting these conversations about different methods started. So coming back to the talking mapping activity, I considered the conversations and the researchers' reflections on them alongside the literature on different types of discussion prompts, different types of elicitation devices. So like other discussion prompts, like photos, the maps deflect attention away from individuals. One researcher said in an interview after the activity, I think that the sessions, they were challenging people to think about their approaches and challenge them in a non-confrontational way, so that people were given space to think and to share without any judgment about what they were doing. This can be of particular benefit in transdisciplinary projects because there can be challenges around methodological hierarchies and challenges in conversations. But beyond this benefit of shifting attention onto a visual and the fact that the maps visually evoked the shared field site, the maps also had two other important benefits. Firstly, the map's representational techniques are closely related to the research methods that were used, and therefore they did prompt discussion of methods. One researcher said in an interview after the activity, the tool that you used was useful because it was like a combination of talking but also the visual stuff. It created a talking point, and then you could also demonstrate what exactly was the method to each other. Secondly, because each of the maps necessarily simplified and abstracted the field site, as all maps by their very nature do, they were what I've called after Dennis with propositional. The idea of maps as propositional devices was expressed very neatly by one of the researchers who said, a map's like, bang, this is the world, what do you think? This researcher went on to say, people don't always like what you've done with a map, but it gets them talking because everyone can have an opinion on whether it makes sense. My map of the qualitative analysis did valuably raise several questions on presentation, which prompted discussion on qualitative interviewing as a method. The researchers talked about the fact that the way people describe their landscape values is as much to do with national and international discourses on nature and talk about landscapes and nature, such as the idea of nature for people, rather than about the field site per se, which points to one particular way that qualitative methods are used, in that they're used to explore individuals, how individuals' beliefs get made, rather than extracting a description of a particular place and marking it on a map. But there were challenges in using maps to prompt methodological discussion. This wasn't a road I was going to go down originally, but I do think this is relevant to what happened during the mapping activities I facilitated. Many of us, whether we have much to do with maps or not, have a tendency to process knowledge in a cartographic way. So Franco Farinelli and Gunnar Olsen called this several years ago now cartographic reason. Briefly, we can describe 5 interrelated aspects of the way we think cartographically. Firstly, our conception of the Earth's surface as a gridded plane. Secondly, that objects of knowledge can be located in this plane. Thirdly, separation of subject and object in objectivism, whereby these objects of knowledge can be observed and recorded by a detached subject. 4, the tendency to mentally process knowledge as separate interreferenceable units on an analogous plane. 5, the recreation of spaces geometrically ordered. The way that the mapping activities were facilitated meant that the researchers' focus was very much on recording information in the map's surface rather than giving attention to what I've called mapping space. After the mapping activities, the researchers expressed the views that I've put on the slides there. Both these descriptions reflect the idea of the structure of knowledge as a plane, as in cartographic reason, in which there are discrete, spatially arranged and stable items of knowledge that can be joined together in the same ontological plane, or layers of separate, though referenceable, planes. There was a tendency to see all objects of knowledge more as fixed truths rather than relative meanings, and this was reinforced by the use of the maps as I facilitated the exercises, rather than the maps prompting exploration of the contrasting types of knowledge, the fixed truths of the spatial ecology method, in contrast to the relative meanings that the qualitative interviewing about landscape values was after. So the differences in knowledge types was rather obfuscated because the different approaches were being thought along similar lines. So, whilst multi-method mapping, as deployed here, requires refinement, for example, additional facilitation to counteract our habitual sort of presentational impulse with maps. So perhaps by making explicit space for researchers to note down more of the moment reflections on their experiences and conversations during the mapping process. But there is potential, I think, for mapping to enable methodological exploration as is required in transdisciplinary working. So I'll leave it there. I don't know how many more minutes there are, but I'd welcome any comments or questions. I think we've got 3 minutes, Bill just said.
Awesome. Any questions for Heather while we can transition between speakers? Okay. Yes, Megan.
Yeah.
If you could repeat the question also.
So Megan asked what's next in the analysis. So this was kind of the first part of the analysis. I think, although I wanted the Ph.D. really to be about mapping, that's my area, I think I'm going to have to think about transdisciplinarity sort of more broadly. And as I picked up on in the concluding comments there, I think there's a lot to explore in terms of facilitation, and I think there might be a whole chapter in my PhD possibly on facilitation, because I deliberately took a very sort of light touch approach to facilitation for the fieldwork here, because I wanted to see how much discussion the maps on their own would generate without me sort of prompting too much. But I think this sort of more concrete, explicit space does need to be made for researchers to actually write down their reflections and then perhaps come back to those written reflections later.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.